They silenced complaints for years until one courtroom moment flipped everything and left them speechless. You ever seen two people walk into a room like they owned the air everyone else was breathing? That's how Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes carried themselves. Shoulders wide, badges shining, mouths just a little too quick with sarcasm, and inside jokes nobody else was in on. They worked out of the 3rd Precinct in Modesto, California. Not a big city, but big enough for things to go unnoticed if you had the right friends. And Mark and Brian? They had plenty. Years on the force, shared beers with captains, took credit for arrests that were more show than substance, knew how to write reports that made themselves look like heroes, even when they weren't. It wasn't just about doing the job. It was about control, power, and they weren't subtle about it. Guy was acting jumpy, had to check it out, Brian would say after pulling over a teenager for nothing but walking home with a hoodie on. Mark would laugh, slap a file on a desk. He's lucky we let him off with a warning. They didn't see themselves as racist. Of course not. They thought of themselves as realists. We know this city, they'd say. We know what to look for. But what they really knew was how to make people feel small. In black neighborhoods like South Side Heights, folks knew the names Callahan and Stokes, not from the news, from the look in their eyes during traffic stops, from being handcuffed on their own porches, from being told, you fit the description, over and over again. But complaints? They rarely went anywhere. One woman filed 3 IA reports in 2 years, said her son was stopped and searched 4 times walking to school, all dismissed. Lack of evidence. No body cam footage that day. Officer Stokes said the boy was reaching for something. Officer Callahan backed him up. That was their thing. Always 2 versions of the same story. Always rehearsed. Always airtight. They'd made a career out of towing the line. Just enough force to scare, not enough to spark headlines. Just enough arrogance to intimidate, not enough to get pulled from duty. They knew how the game worked, and for a long time, they were winning. One afternoon, Mark leaned on his patrol car, sunglasses on, smirking as he told a rookie, "People think they can fight the system. Let them try. You just gotta make the right friends and keep your paperwork clean." Brian added, "Besides, who are they gonna believe, them or us?" And for years, he was right. But something shifted that fall. Not loudly, not all at once. Just a few things, almost unnoticeable. First came the phone camera videos. Grainy, shaky, but damning. Then came one specific complaint, detailed, backed by timestamps, and from a woman who refused to back down. Her name was Alicia Pearson. Her younger brother, Dorian, had been shoved face first into the pavement outside a liquor store. No weapon, no warrant, just suspicion. "He matched the look of someone we were searching for," Callahan said. But Alicia, she had receipts, cell phone records, timestamped texts, GPS pings, showing her brother was in a tutoring center 10 blocks away when the supposed crime happened. She showed up at City Hall. She talked to local news. She wouldn't let it go. Even then, Mark and Brian didn't flinch. They'd seen this before. People get loud, then life wears them down. Bills pile up, attention fades, the system buries it. But Alicia was different, and that's when the city started to notice. A civil rights attorney picked up the case. Protests outside the station didn't go away after 2 weeks. They grew. Pressure mounted. The mayor made a statement. An internal investigation was reopened. Still, the detectives weren't worried. In their minds, they were untouchable. "You really think they're gonna side with her over us?" Brian scoffed. Mark just shook his head. "Let them make noise. They always do. Nothing ever sticks." But this time, something did. The morning it all started to fall apart, Brian showed up late to the station, coffee in one hand, a smirk on his face like nothing in the world could touch him. Mark was already at his desk, flipping through paperwork, pretending to work, but mostly just waiting for something to distract him. "Guess who's back in the news again?" Brian said, dropping a newspaper onto Mark's desk. Alicia Pearson's face was on the front page, beneath a headline that read, "Sister of assault victim files federal civil rights lawsuit against MPD." Mark barely looked up. Let her have her 15 minutes. But something in his voice was thinner than usual. Brian didn't catch it, or maybe he ignored it. "Lawsuit's a joke. We've got immunity. It's just noise." He was right about one thing. They did know how to play the game. They'd both been through depositions before. They knew how to deflect, twist a timeline, blur a story, just enough to make the truth feel like speculation. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the department had already started shifting behind their backs. It started with whispers. A couple officers from Internal Affairs were seen speaking with other patrolmen. A file disappeared from the records room, then reappeared, updated, with redactions removed. Word spread that the Department of Justice had quietly reached out. They were asking questions now, not just about Dorian Pearson, but about 5 other names, all black men, all pulled over, detained, or handled by Callahan and Stokes in the last 3 years. 2 of them had moved out of town. One of them had never filed a complaint, but suddenly came forward. Mark could feel the tension crawling into the walls. "I'm telling you, something's coming," he said one afternoon in the locker room, voice low, no smirk this time. Brian waved him off. "We've got friends. The union's with us. We keep our mouths shut, let legal handle it." But Mark wasn't so sure anymore. One night, he checked his email and saw a name he hadn't seen in years, Celeste Jamison. Back when she was a junior attorney in the city's legal division, she'd investigated a harassment complaint involving 2 other officers in their precinct. Mark had been interviewed during that case, nothing major, just procedural. But he remembered how she looked at him, like she already knew the answers and just needed him to say something stupid. She didn't play the politics game, which is why nobody expected her to last. But she did. Quietly, carefully. She moved departments. Then she disappeared from the city completely. Now here she was, back in town. Mark didn't mention her to Brian. He didn't want to look paranoid. But he couldn't stop thinking about her name in his inbox. The subject line read, "Personnel Review Inquiry, Officer Mark Callahan." The body of the message was just one line, "You'll be hearing from me soon." He didn't sleep that night. 2 days later, the department issued a memo, dry, official sounding, but heavy underneath. All active lawsuits involving officer conduct were now being overseen by a new lead from Internal Affairs. Her name was in bold, Celeste A. Jamison, Esq. Brian read it and snorted. Great, they brought in a babysitter. But Mark didn't laugh. He remembered the time he and Brian laughed in a hallway, cracking jokes about a complaint Celeste had filed against another officer. He remembered looking over his shoulder and seeing her standing there, listening, saying nothing, just watching. Now she wasn't watching anymore. She was in charge, but neither of them were prepared for what she'd do next. The morning of the hearing, Mark adjusted his collar in the mirror a little longer than usual. His hands didn't feel steady, but he wouldn't say that out loud, not to Brian, not to anyone. These hearings were usually formalities. Show up, sit down, let the lawyers smooth everything over. Still, something felt different. Brian pulled up in his black SUV, music low, sunglasses on like always. "You ready to play the game?" he asked, half smiling. Mark nodded, but didn't answer. They drove in silence most of the way to the Stanislaus County Superior Court, passing downtown murals, families walking to school, a group of people holding small cardboard signs by the courthouse steps. Mark glanced at them. Protesters? Brian shrugged. Professional complainers. They parked in the back lot, walked through the security checkpoint, and made their way to courtroom 4B. Inside, the buzz of conversation stopped as the 2 officers entered. Dorian Pearson sat in the front row with Alicia beside him. Their lawyer, a sharp-looking woman in a gray suit, whispered something into Alicia's ear, and she nodded without breaking her stare at Mark and Brian. The 2 detectives took their seats at the defendant's table, arms folded, expressions blank. The judge, an older white man with years of routine in his voice, called the session to order. This hearing concerns the civil suit brought against officers Mark Callahan and Brian Stokes regarding alleged use of excessive force and racial profiling. Before we begin formal statements, the court acknowledges the appointment of a new representative from the department's Internal Affairs Division. That got Brian's attention. He leaned slightly toward Mark. That memo was real? Mark didn't answer. The judge continued, "Counsel for the department, please step forward." The room went quiet. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and in walked Celeste Jamison. Not a whisper, not a gasp, just a heavy silence. She walked with quiet authority, no rush, no nerves. Navy blazer, hair pulled back, tablet in hand. Her heels echoed across the floor. Dorian sat up straighter. Alicia narrowed her eyes. The officers? They froze. Mark felt like someone had just pulled the floor from under him. The judge nodded toward her. "Ms. Jamison, thank you for appearing on such short notice." She replied calmly, "It's no problem, Your Honor. This department has gone without real accountability for far too long." She turned, looked right at Mark, then Brian. Not like she was remembering something, like she never forgot. Brian whispered, "No way, that's her?" Mark didn't respond. Celeste placed her tablet on the desk. "For the record, I've assumed full authority over the disciplinary review of these two officers, effective immediately. All documentation, case files, and internal complaints related to their behavior over the past 6 years have been re-examined. Some of those complaints were never addressed. Others were buried." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you're prepared to speak to those findings during this hearing?" She looked at him without blinking. "Yes, Your Honor, in detail." Mark's chest tightened. He glanced at Brian, whose lips were now a thin, nervous line. Nobody in that courtroom could mistake what was happening. This wasn't just another departmental slap on the wrist. This was someone who knew the system and came back to shake it from the inside. The judge nodded. "Very well, Ms. Jamison, you may begin." Celeste clicked her tablet and cleared her throat. "I'd like to start with an incident from August 14th, 2021. Subject, Dorian Pearson. 2 officers. No warrant. No probable cause. Body camera conveniently inactive. But thankfully, Mr. Pearson was not alone. And he's not the only one." She tapped again, and that's when the first video started to play. But what was on that video was only the beginning. The screen flickered to life. A cell phone video filled the courtroom, shaky but clear enough to see what mattered. Dorian on the ground, face scraped, hands behind his back. Mark standing over him, Brian pacing, one hand near his holster. Alicia's voice screaming off camera. "You said he matched a description, but you never said of who." The sound echoed in the courtroom. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Brian looked away. Mark stared down at his shoes. Celeste let the silence hang for a beat before she spoke. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, and the department has had knowledge of this pattern for years." She slid a file across to the judge. 32 complaints in 6 years. Same officers. Same tactics. No meaningful investigation. Until now. Mark's face flushed hot. He could feel everyone watching him. People he used to pass in the halls without a second glance. And now he felt like they were seeing him for who he really was. Celeste looked over again, not with anger, with precision. "Let me tell you something about how patterns are protected," she said. "It's not just the bad behavior. It's the silence around it. The reports that vanish. The body cams that somehow stop working at the same moment, again and again. The department has enabled this, not just by failing to act, but by choosing not to act." She turned to face the courtroom gallery. "Ask yourself, if this can happen to Dorian Pearson in broad daylight with witnesses and video, what do you think happened in the cases where there was no camera?" A man in the back of the room nodded slowly. An older woman reached for her daughter's hand. Mark didn't recognize any of them, but somehow they all seemed to recognize him. Brian muttered, "We should have had union counsel present." Celeste didn't even look at him. "You had every chance to do things right. You were warned. You were protected. But you weren't careful. You got used to thinking no one could touch you." She turned back to the judge. "Permission to call my first witness?" The judge nodded. Celeste's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I call Officer Renee Alston to the stand." The courtroom doors opened again, and in walked a uniformed officer. Black woman, late 30s, strong posture, eyes forward. Brian shifted. Mark's eyes widened. They knew her. They used to tease her at roll call, called her Miss Rookie Detective, even though she'd been there nearly as long as them. She never laughed. Renee sat at the witness stand, raised her right hand, and was sworn in. Celeste stepped forward. "Officer Alston, you worked with Detectives Callahan and Stokes for how long?" 5 years. "Were you ever present during an incident where you believed excessive force was used?" Renee hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the moment meant something. "Yes." "Why didn't you report it at the time?" "I did, but the report was removed from the system 2 days later. I was told by my supervisor to drop it or face retaliation by association." Brian slammed his hand on the table. "That's a lie." The judge banged his gavel once. "Control yourself, officer." Mark leaned forward, whispering, "We're cooked." Celeste kept going. She called more witnesses. a retired captain who said he flagged the officer's behavior, a former IA investigator who admitted they were told to stand down, a mother who said her teenage son hasn't left the house in 2 years after a run-in with Brian outside a gas station. The air in the room kept getting heavier, and through it all, Celeste stood still, calm, exact. She wasn't the angry outsider anymore. She was the system now, and she'd come prepared. But the real damage hadn't hit them yet. That was coming next. The judge called for a short recess. Mark sat frozen, barely blinking. Brian rubbed the bridge of his nose like that would erase everything. But it was all there now, on record, on video, in sworn statements, and everyone had seen it. When court resumed, Celeste didn't waste a second. She stepped back to the center of the room, tablet in hand. "I'd like to present a supplemental file to the court," she said. "This document contains a breakdown of complaints, radio logs, and officer GPS movement that contradicts the statements given by Detectives Callahan and Stokes in at least 9 separate reports." She handed it to the judge, then turned the screen toward the audience. "This is from February 2nd, 2020. Officers Callahan and Stokes claimed they pursued a suspect through the east alley behind 7th Street. The body cam was off. They said the man fled, but according to the city's own dispatch records," she tapped the screen, "they were sitting in a parking lot for 23 minutes during the alleged chase. The suspect was never seen running, no foot pursuit logged, and no drugs were found because there were none." Brian opened his mouth but didn't speak. There wasn't a comeback for that. Not this time. Celeste continued, flipping to the next tab. "This is a list of emails, internal ones, between supervisors, legal teams, and IA. Most were marked resolved without investigation. Several have identical language, copy-pasted." She looked at the judge. "It's what you call a template of denial, and the system used it well." She paused, then pointed to one last name. "This one's important. It's an officer who filed 2 internal complaints and then requested a department transfer. His name is Luis Benavides. He's agreed to submit a written testimony." The courtroom doors opened again. A slim man in plain clothes walked in quietly and sat in the witness box. You could hear the scrape of his chair as he sat down. He looked nervous, but determined. "Officer Benavides, when you filed your complaints, what happened?" Luis cleared his throat. "First one. Nothing happened. I asked my supervisor 3 times, and he kept saying they were looking into it. Next thing I knew, I was taken off patrol and stuck behind a desk for 6 months. Did anyone tell you why?" "They said I needed to refocus, but everyone knew why. You speak up, you get iced out." Celeste nodded slowly. "Did your report involve either of the defendants?" Luis shifted uncomfortably, then looked straight ahead. "Yeah. I watched Stokes slam a kid against a wall over a vape pen. Mark backed it up in his report. The kid was like 15, just scared. I filed it that same day. Were you ever interviewed about that report?" "No." "Did you ever see it mentioned in department meetings?" Luis laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "No, it disappeared." Brian looked like he wanted to crawl out of his chair. Mark didn't even raise his head. The courtroom was still, not even a cough. The truth didn't need yelling, it just needed daylight. Celeste stepped back. "Your Honor, this is the part where people usually say, 'We didn't know,' or 'We tried our best.' But the truth is, they did know. Everyone did, and they chose to look the other way." The judge leaned forward, brows tight, fingers steepled. "Ms. Jamison," he said, voice low, "are you prepared to pursue internal disciplinary charges separate from this lawsuit?" "Yes, Your Honor, effective immediately. A full IA review is underway. Independent oversight will be present at every level." Mark whispered to Brian, "We're screwed. This isn't damage control. This is execution." Brian didn't respond. He looked like someone who just realized the floor wasn't under him anymore, and maybe never had been. But the worst part wasn't what had already come out. It was what still hadn't. By the time the courtroom recessed again, neither Mark nor Brian spoke. They didn't look at each other. They didn't look at anyone. For the first time in years, they weren't in control. Outside, reporters lined the sidewalk. People gathered under cloudy skies with signs that read things like, "We remember Dorian," and "Justice for Southside Heights." They weren't yelling. They didn't have to. Their presence said everything. Inside, Celeste flipped through her notes like she was preparing for a class she could teach blindfolded. Mark finally leaned over to Brian. "We need a lawyer, our own, not the union." Brian's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're not going to back us now." They both knew it. The air had shifted. That badge that used to feel like armor now weighed heavy around their necks. When court resumed, Celeste stood again. "I'd like to read into record one final set of documents. These are from a 2018 case involving a minor referred to as KS at the time. The official report stated the juvenile resisted arrest and attempted to flee. However," she tapped her tablet and a projector screen lit up. "New footage provided by a bystander tells a different story." On the screen, a teenager, barely over 13, stood against a fence, hands up, crying. Mark grabbed him by the arm, twisted him down. Brian stood over, yelling something inaudible. The kid never moved, never resisted. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Someone cursed under their breath. Celeste didn't react. She let the video speak. When it ended, she looked at the judge. This report was signed by both defendants, and it was used to justify expulsion from school, a juvenile record, and 6 months in a behavioral facility. The judge flipped through the report. "Where is this young man now?" Celeste turned her head slightly. "He's here." The door opened. A tall young man in a hoodie stepped in, followed by his mother. Brian's head dropped. Celeste walked over and placed a hand gently on the young man's shoulder. "This is Kendrick Solomon. He's now 18, and he's agreed to give a brief statement." Kendrick stood at the front. His voice shook, but his words didn't. "I lost 2 years of my life because of a lie. I missed football tryouts. My grades dropped. I thought I was broken. But my mom, she kept fighting, told me I wasn't crazy, that it did happen. I wasn't violent. I wasn't wrong. They were." His mom wiped her eyes. A few others did too. The judge nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Kendrick." Celeste took her place again. "Your Honor, the point isn't just to punish. The point is to restore what was lost. This system crushed kids like Kendrick. It silenced officers like Alston, and it gave men like Callahan and Stokes room to grow bolder with every unchecked mistake." Mark finally spoke. His voice cracked. "We were doing our jobs." Celeste turned to him, calm and cold. "No, you were doing what you could get away with. There's a difference." The room was silent again. The judge took a breath. "I've seen enough. A formal review by the city's oversight board will begin next week. But as of today, Detectives Callahan and Stokes are suspended from duty, pending termination." Gasps, movement, a ripple across the benches. Mark slumped back. Brian stared into nothing. Celeste didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just gathered her things. Outside, people were waiting, not to celebrate, but to breathe. For the first time in years, it felt like they could, but there was still one thing left for Celeste to say, and she saved it for the end. The courtroom had cleared out. People lingered in the hallway, talking in low voices, processing everything. The weight of the day still hung in the air, like the smell of rain after a storm. Wet, heavy, and undeniable. Mark sat on the edge of the defendant's table, staring at his badge like it belonged to someone else. Brian leaned against the wall, arms folded tight, jaw locked, but his eyes drifting. They didn't speak. What was there to say? Their power had been their silence. But today, silence had no power left. Inside, Celeste Jamison packed up her files one by one. She moved with the same quiet intensity that had carried her through the hearing, through years of being doubted, dismissed, second-guessed. A clerk approached. "Ms. Jamison, the media is requesting a statement." Celeste shook her head. Let them read the record. She didn't come to perform. She came to correct something broken. But before she could leave, Judge Harville looked up from the bench. "Ms. Jamison, if you don't mind, a final word?" She turned. "I've been on this bench 21 years, he said. Seen more hearings than I can count. But I've rarely seen anyone come in as prepared as you, or as clear." Celeste nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I hope you plan to stay in this position a long time." She gave a small smile. "I don't plan to disappear again." Outside, the crowd had grown, not shouting, just waiting. waiting to see what accountability looked like in real time. Alicia Pearson stood at the steps with her brother beside her. Kendrick and his mom weren't far. Officer Renee Alston stayed too, even though she could have slipped away quietly. Celeste stepped out. People stepped aside, giving her room, not out of fear, but respect. A different kind of presence now, not loud, not aggressive, but real and earned. Alicia approached. "You didn't just speak for Dorian today. You spoke for all of us." Celeste looked her in the eyes. "You did that. I just helped the right people hear it." Dorian gave a small nod. "Thank you." Celeste turned to Kendrick next. "You okay?" He shrugged. "Still figuring that out." She nodded. "That's fair. Just don't let them tell you what your story is. That's yours to own." He smiled, just a little. A reporter tried to cut through the crowd. "Miss Jamison, do you believe justice was served today?" Celeste paused, then looked straight ahead. "Accountability happened today. Justice is what happens next." She didn't stay for more questions. Back inside, the station buzzed. Word had already reached the 3rd precinct. Desks were cleaned out. Emails circulated. Some officers stayed silent. Others whispered. But something had changed. For years, Mark and Brian had laughed at internal affairs, called it the retirement home of the bitter and the soft. Now, that home had a leader who wasn't interested in optics or office politics. She was interested in truth, the kind that shows up with evidence, the kind that doesn't care if you have 15 years in or just made detective, the kind that doesn't flinch when you try to bluff your way through. Celeste sat in her new office that night, late, alone. The plaque on her desk was still blank, just Internal Affairs Director. She stared at it for a moment, then pulled out a pen. In small, clean handwriting, she wrote, Celeste A. Jamison. Underneath, a quote she'd carried since law school, something her grandmother once told her. "Don't wait to be allowed in. Walk in like the door should have been open all along." She leaned back. She didn't feel victorious. She felt ready, because this wasn't a finish line. It was the start of something harder and more necessary. The city was watching now, so was the department, but more importantly, so were the people who'd stopped believing anyone would ever listen. Maybe today changed that, not for everyone, but for some. And sometimes, some is where everything begins, and that's the lesson. Power without accountability breaks everything it touches. But truth, real, painful, sometimes slow truth, can put cracks in walls that seemed permanent. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to show up ready. Celeste did. And now she's in charge. If this story hit you, even a little, don't let it sit silent. Share it. Talk about it. Ask questions when something feels wrong. Support people who speak up, especially when it costs them something. The system doesn't change from the top. It changes when enough people say, "Not anymore." And if someone tells you they were hurt, dismissed, profiled, or ignored, believe them. Because the people who carry the weight of silence the longest are usually the ones who speak the clearest when they finally get the mic.